Welcome back to Everard Junction. In today's video we're going to be doing a complete tour of the layout. I last did one of these about 2 or 3 years ago and quite a bit has changed on the layout, so this will serve as a bit of an update to that older video. And for those of you who haven't seen it and are perhaps a bit curious as to how big this layout is and sort of what it does in the room, hopefully this will help you sort of better understand how the layout is as a whole package. So the layout is situated in the attic of the house. This is a 1930s semi-detached house with a hip roof. So you can see, being built an extremely long time ago, it doesn't have many beams getting in the way of the layout, so that's really nice. It's generally a good space to put a model railway. However, obviously it was very poorly insulated, so I've put a lot of PIR insulation, Celotex, Kingspan, whatever you want to call it, up in the roof. I've boarded over that. It's also got this aluminium sort of foil insulation stuff over the top of it as well. So basically what I've done is insulated the roof of the attic best I can anyway with the available funds to try and keep heat in here when I warm the place up, and that just keeps things a little bit nicer for the winter. Obviously I'll lose a bit of heat into the adjacent property. Could put some insulation over the wall there, but budget was very much an issue and I just did the best I could. On a cold day, as long as I've got the heater going for about 20 minutes, it's quite nice up here and I can work for a few hours. One of the most important parts of the layout is the lighting. The lighting runs around the whole layout following the route of the track, and there's also some general lighting higher up in the ceiling to give some general light to the entire room. Most of these lights are using LEDs, and I think it's really important to make sure a layout is well lit, not just for filming, but it really helps with the enthusiasm and motivation with regards to working on the layout if it's in a nice, bright, airy feeling space. Higher up in the roof you can see the additional lighting I have. Most of this again is LED, as it's important obviously, especially these days, to try and save a bit of electricity if you can. And I'm really pleased with those, have been working really well, and they just give a nice general bright airy feeling to the room without necessarily lighting the layout itself. Over on the station side of the layout, once again we have lights aimed specifically at the layout, and one thing else to mention is this white-faced hardboard that I've put over the top of the insulation. Just really helps with making the room feel a bit brighter and airier than it otherwise would be. A common question I get is how big is the layout, what's the depth of the baseboards, how high is the layout from the ground, and what is the overall footprint of the layout in the room. The layout in general is a large rectangle going around the edge of the attic with 3 scenic sections and 1 storage area. The storage area, or fiddle yard, is approximately 4 meters long, measured from the face closest to the camera. So we've got a baseboard at the far end there, a baseboard in the middle, and a baseboard just here. Added together, all of that is 4 meters. Turning left from that storage area, we have the countryside section. This section, measured from the inside edge, is 3.5 meters long. Turning left from that, the section that progresses into the town area on the layout is 4 meters long, this section being on the opposite side to the storage area or fiddle yard. And the final section with the station is 3.5 meters long, being on the opposite side to the countryside section of the layout. The height of the layout varies. The track is 700 millimeters from the floor of the attic. Well, I did that deliberately to give me the largest possible layout for this space. The house has a pitched roof on 3 of its sides, so obviously the higher from the ground or floor the layout is, the
more it has to come in towards the centre of the room. So this is a sort of compromise that works for me with regards to still being able to work on the layout comfortably, but also have as much space as possible. Most of the track, as I say, is 700mm from the floor of the attic. The only exception to that is the branch line that you can see here curving off underneath the main lines. That branch line starts at the station at the same height as everything else, 700mm, and over its distance it drops 100mm, so there is sufficient clearance for it to disappear off-scene underneath that bridge. The height of the scenery on the layout varies significantly, and it just depends where you are. Some parts of the scenery are up above track level, others significantly below. The storage area is 800mm deep. The station is 700mm deep. The scrapyard and industrial section is 880mm deep, with the countryside section being the same at 880mm.
So let's go around the entire room in greater detail and just show the different parts of the layout, and I'll sort of do my best to explain what's changed since the last video where we did a tour. So starting over on this corner of the layout, this is the entrance to the fiddle yard. The track is coming around a curve from behind the town scene, comes around these corners and works its way into multiple sidings or storage roads for the various locomotives and rolling stock that I use frequently on the layout. Of course, like any modeler, I do have some overflow. There are some other models downstairs that make an appearance on the layout from time to time, but generally speaking, I try not to buy or collect much more than what the fiddle yard can hold, and I stick to quite a strict time period during 1988, 1989 and early 1990 for the era of the layout, and that's really good for controlling the budget, but also controlling the amount of models that I actually have in my possession. So since the previous layout tour, an awful lot has changed in this section. I've basically rebuilt the entire fiddle yard, added some extra storage to it, and I pushed the baseboard deeper so it goes right to the roof of the house where that DMU has just passed. The main reason for changing all of this and rebuilding the baseboard and relaying all of the track was to allow for better running of the rolling stock and the locomotives through the fiddle yard. Previously, I had used a mixture of second and third radius curves to get from the scenic section of the layout around this corner into the fiddle yard itself. And for certain items of rolling stock, specifically the Cavalex TEA, which is currently parked over the back there, as well as a few other items from the likes of Revolution Trains and Helian, I was getting derailments, to cut a long story short, and the cause of those derailments was these models being incredibly well detailed and just lacking the ability to go round those tight second radius curves. So by changing the curves to fourth radius or greater and making sure I use only streamline points rather than set track points, basically streamline points are a little bit more gentle than your traditional set track points, just allows everything to run really nicely. And since I've done all of this work to the fiddle yard, I've had almost zero derailments. The layout runs extremely well. I've not had any problems with any of my rolling stock, and it has genuinely become a joy to operate, really. I can basically pick any train, any route, any direction, and I know it's going to behave itself. So running around the scenic part of the layout, the majority of the track is a 4-track main line, and you can see those 4 tracks splitting off there and coming into the fiddle yard. Each one of those goes through a freeway point, which then splits out into additional routes to give me as many tracks as possible to store the various trains. I've also got a couple of head shunts on those sections just for a little bit of additional locomotive storage, and you can just about get a 2-car DMU in there. Being approximately 4 metres in length, the fiddle yard does give me quite a lot of space to store various trains, so you can see most of the trains in here are full length or as close to what the real length would be in real life. Moving to the far end of the fiddle yard, you can see it's pretty much a repeat of the entrance. Once again, you can see there's a couple of head shunts at this end, just for a little bit of additional loco and DMU storage. Moving right to the end, you can see the various curves, and you can see where I had to dig up all of the ballast and rebuild and rework all of these baseboards to allow for the redevelopment of the fiddle yard. I'd say it's been over a year now since I've done that. It was certainly worth it. Everything runs really, really nicely, and I no longer get any of the derailments that I was getting with the more detailed and delicate rolling stock. All of the track in the fiddle yard is code 100, most of it being left over from my previous layout. As you can imagine, to buy all new track for this section would cost an awful lot of money, not just in points but also in straight track and curves. So I made sure to reuse as much of the old track as possible from my previous layout and used the Pico code 75 to code 100 transfer pieces, which I'll show you shortly, to transition to the more fine scale track on the scenic section of the layout. Before we run around the scenic section of the layout, I will give you a brief explanation of the branch line, as there's a section here that differs to the overall rectangular appearance of the layout. So the branch line starts off at a bay platform in the station. That's a dead-end section of track. It does not go any further than the station. It works its way down a gentle gradient, dropping approximately 100 millimeters along its length to go underneath the main lines and the relief lines here. And you can see how it comes around this curve through a sort of wooded area, and it then disappears underneath the layout before going underneath the back scene over by those trees and that last house. It does not run into the storage area. Instead, it goes onto this baseboard that you can see in the background there behind the main storage section. That is a small baseboard, and it contains a reverse loop. A reverse loop is basically a circle of track that allows a train to loop back onto itself and go back up the line it's just travelled down. It is in effect a turnaround area, and I did that for one main reason. Cleaning the track on the layout is important, and I use a CMX track cleaner. It is a brass wagon made to very high standards, and it is quite heavy. It has to be pulled by a locomotive. It does not like being pushed, and obviously the branch line is also on a gradient as well. So I put a turnaround, a reverse loop at the end of the branch line, so that when track cleaning is underway, the large locomotive comes down the hill with the track cleaning wagon, it turns round and it runs back up the hill. At no point does it push the wagon and risk derailments in difficult to access parts of the layout. So far, it's been working very well. At the other end of the branch line, you can see here is where it terminates in this platform by the retaining wall at the station. There's a set of buffers up there just before the waiting room, and the way this works is on an automatic shuttling system, so I don't actually have to drive the trains manually and stop them each time they come into this area. Obviously, you can imagine over a prolonged running session, manually driving a unit in and out of the station all the time would get quite tedious. To achieve the automatic running, I use the Lens BM1 modules. This is basically just a small board with a few diodes on it, and one of those is situated under the layout in this section. And basically what it's doing is it's sending a slightly different signal to the track in this area, and in doing that it provides communication to the decoder to say you're coming to the end of the line and you need to slow down and stop. That's what you can see this Class 205 doing now by itself. So the decoder in the 205 has realised it's entered what Lens calls a braking section, and it's now slowing down to a stop, and it will wait for a predetermined amount of time, which you can set in the decoder, change direction and head back down the branch line in the opposite direction. Using that system, this branch line basically runs itself all day long, and it's a real nice addition to the layout, as I don't necessarily have to have stuff running on the main lines constantly to enjoy it. I can have something just quietly shuttling up and down the branch whilst perhaps I'm doing some work on other sections of the layout. Lens refer to this technology as ABC braking, and it is certainly very effective. I've not had any major issues with it. I had a couple of problems when I initially set the system up, but that turned out to be issues with some of my decoders rather than the system itself.
It is important to remember that not all decoders support the Lens ABC braking functionality, so when selecting a unit for a system like this, just make sure you buy a decoder that supports the ABC braking technology. In this case, the Class 205 that's just leaving has an ESU Locksound version 5 decoder in it, and that does support the Lens ABC braking. So as you can appreciate, with the sound switched on the Class 205, obviously it sounds quite good being able to sort of slow down and stop itself and all that kind of stuff. You've got changing in tones in the DCC sound and things like brakes squealing and hissing of air and stuff like that. It makes the unit more interesting to listen to and to operate, rather than it just droning around the room at a constant speed.
Moving from here, we move on to the scenic section of the layout, which you can see starts there. So we have a backboard here just to provide a scenic break, so that when on the scenic section of the layout you can't quite see all of this. So here we are on the first scenic section of the layout. This is the countryside section, and the idea is that you're experiencing a gradual transition from countryside into town. You can see we've got a couple of houses over there, so we've got sort of your typical housing estate that you might find on the edge of town, and then that slowly gets more and more built up as we work our way around the layout.
The layout is inspired by the Great Western Main Line, and as such the tracks are arranged in a similar style. So what we have here is what the Great Western would call the main and the relief lines. On the main lines we have west and eastbound lines, and these main lines would carry your fast passenger trains, express parcels and things like that. On here we have the relief lines, once again westbound and eastbound. These take your slower trains, most of your freight, if not all of your freight, and the slow stopping services with things like DMUs and stuff like that. Other railways in the UK will have their tracks arranged differently, but as this is inspired by the Great Western, we have your main lines or your fast lines and your relief lines or your slow lines, for want of a better word. In order to transfer from the chunkier Code 100 track in the storage area to the finer Code 75 track on the scenic section, Peco make these handy little joining pieces, and you can see how you've got both types of track on the same piece. You can see here the chunkier appearance of the rail and the finer appearance of the Code 75 rail, which then transitions into Code 75 for the entirety of the scenic section, before running through one of these again on the station side to go back into the storage area.
This section has changed and been updated quite a bit since the previous layout tour. So you can see we've got a sort of farmer's sort of plate girder bridge there, nothing too crazy. I wanted to try something different when breaking up the transition from scenic to unscenic in this area. So many times we just put tunnels in, so you'd have a hillside coming down like this, and then you'd have some tunnel portals. I've done it myself in the past, it works very well, but it's very common to see. I wanted to try something a little bit different. So in this case what I've done is I've put in a small sort of farmer's bridge, and then there's a bit of a gap to sort of force a bit of perspective, and then we've got the backboard. You can see I've added various embankments and trees and bushes just to sort of blend things in and make it look a bit more interesting. The layout is loosely based on the Great Western Main Line heading out of Paddington, and it's situated, if it was a real place, anywhere really from Slough all the way up to Didcot. It's just a general representation, but I try to take things that I've seen along the line and put them on the layout, albeit in a slightly condensed style, just to help sort of make the railway feel a little bit more authentic. So this is very typical to a lot of the plate girder sort of small track bridges that you see over the Great Western Main Line in this area of the country. There's numerous versions of them all along the line, and this is just my representation of a generic version of that. So as you can see, we've got quite a lot of scenery here. We've got a field which has just been sort of left to go sort of fallow, just sort of a bit of scrubland really. There's no crops or livestock in there. We've got a path around the edge for dog walkers, things like that. And then you can see the rest of it is just sort of embankments with trees and bushes to help sort of hide the transition from the scenic section of the layout into the fiddle yard. And provided you sit in the right spot and get the angle right, I think it works quite well. As mentioned in the previous video, we've now got fascia boards around the entirety of the layout, and these have been painted in black and then blended in to the edge of the scenery, and I'm really pleased with how that looks. It just makes everything look a little bit more professional. Over on this side we've got the farm track which disappears, and you can just about see British Rail have turned up with a Land Rover, and one of the guys has worked his way down to this little equipment sort of spot. That's a scale model scenery kit. It's just sort of entrenched into the side of the hillside just there. You can see there's a few plants and a sort of rough path and stuff leading down to it. But generally the idea here is just to hide the corner of the back scene and just blend things in. So you can see on the left-hand side we've got a printed photo back scene, and on the right-hand side it's just my attempt to just sort of blend that in further. So that's just a piece of plywood, and I used various spray cans in different colours to just create a sort of dull-looking sky that blends in to the photographic back scene that we have on the left here. And I'm quite pleased with how that turned out. Further along we've got the first of the main plate girder bridges that carry the railway, and you can see the branch line goes underneath. Once again, I've done my best with the available space to try and make this look as authentic and convincing as possible. Of course, there's plenty of work that can still be added to it, but I'm quite pleased with how that's turned out in the end. This is quite a difficult area to sort of get looking right because I'm constrained by the available space and the geometry of the track. At the end of the day, it's really important that the railway just works and runs properly, and I'll do my best afterwards to make it look realistic. Sometimes that isn't always possible and you have to make a compromise, but as you can see, everything seems to be working quite well, and the various bits of brick and weathering and detail I've added, I think, sort of lend themselves to telling a story that this branch line goes under here to a different destination, and that's sort of what I'm trying to do. So if we move a little bit further along, you can see the houses in the background. Those are a scratch build, still a work in progress currently, but that will eventually form some sort of 1970s housing estate. If we look into the middle here, we've got basically a sort of small valley drainage area, if you like, for the surface runoff coming away from that embankment, and it just again provides a nice sort of viewpoint to look across and enjoy the trains going past, as well as enjoying the different elevations in terrain. Something that works really well for me on a model railway is elevation in terrain. It keeps it exciting, it keeps it interesting. It's very easy just to build a table, put your track on the table, and then just do all your stuff either side of the track. But you end up with everything being on the same elevation, and even if you make a really nice professional job of it, it can look a little bit boring, for want of a better word. So where possible, if you can, try and elevate the terrain of your model railway. Maybe have your track on one level and your scenery on another. I've built the layout in such a way that most of the scenery is carved out using foam, so I can afford to have rises and falls in the terrain pretty much wherever I like. And as you can see, that works really well in a section like this, where we've got an elevated embankment forming into a small valley and then back up to an embankment again. And even panning over to the left, you can see we've got another change in terrain just there, where we've got this small sort of stream running off again, drainage from the area. As you can see, I've made use of the static grass and the ground cover and stuff. Most of the ground cover is from Woodland Scenics. The static grass is from Model Scene, various different lengths and colours used there. The ballast is all Woodland Scenics, and the track is all Pico. The track on the branch line is the Pico Bullhead range. This is a slightly older style of track that you would have typically seen on single lines in the 60s, 70s and 80s. If you look carefully, you can still find it today if you know where to look. And up on the main and relief lines, it's all flat bottom rail with concrete sleepers. Again, typical for the Great Western Main Line during this time period. There's lots of little kits and things from Scale Model Scenery. All of the cable troughing on the layout is from Scale Model Scenery. The relay boxes are a Pico or Wills kit, depending on where I got them from. And there's various other bits and pieces as well. You get so many bits and bobs on a model railway, it's impossible to remember where it all turned up from. But again, hopefully you can see the different elevations there, how you can appreciate two trains running in the same direction but on a different elevation. And then we've got the nice sort of transition where the 117 is heading off underneath the Farmers Bridge, the 205 is going somewhere completely different, and now we've got a freight coming the other way. So this area I really like. It's a nice relaxing spot to enjoy the layout, and just being countryside, relatively simple to build and put together, doesn't take too long, and certainly looks impressive from most angles. So if we continue to work our way around the corner, we're now working our way towards a slightly more urban environment now, and we've got the beginnings of a small industrial estate forming down in this section here. So when I built the layout, one of the things I really wanted was the smoothest, most progressive broad curves possible. If there's one thing I can't stand, it's watching a model train go around a corner that's too tight. It just doesn't look very good. I'm very fortunate in having access to this large loft space that I could really push the boundaries in terms of the radius in the track and turn the corners of the layout into a feature rather than something to try and hide behind tunnel portals and baseboard. So you can see how generous the curves are, how smoothly everything progresses, and it just adds to that level of realism. If you're building a model railway, try not to fall into the trap of trying to make your straights last as long as possible and then diving into a tight turn. Instead, consider perhaps making your straight sections as short as possible and have as many swooping curves transitioning from one to the other as possible. Your railway will run a lot better, your rolling stock will appreciate that, and it will also look more realistic, as in real life, trains can't go around sharp corners. There's a good example just there. So we've got a long Speedlink freight there. That's actually modelled after a real picture of a real Speedlink train. And you can see how the corners really sort of blend in and look convincing. In real life, these would still be considered quite tight, but in model form, you can get away with it. This is a good opportunity to talk about the back scenes on the layout. So all of the back scenes are made by ID Back Scenes, and this is a photographic back scene. This particular one is called Into the Town. It's quite popular. Quite a lot of modelers use it. The main reason I used it when I built this layout originally is certainly at the time, it may have changed now, but at the time it was the only back scene I could find that was long enough to span the entire scenic section of this layout. There were many other back scenes that I liked as well, but they simply weren't long enough. And one of the problems you can have is if you've got a back scene of one style and then you go to a different back scene for the other part of your layout, trying to get the transition between those two back scenes looking good can be really difficult. So I went for Into the Town by ID Back Scenes, and I'm really pleased with it. As mentioned in previous videos, I am in the process of replacing these back scenes with exactly the same type. It's just they've been up here for a long time now. They're starting to look a little bit tired, wrinkled and dog-eared in a few places, although the camera is relatively sympathetic to their appearance. Basically what's happened is I have so far replaced all of them up to here, and this corner is still a work in progress. So when I get the motivation, I will finish replacing all of the back scenes, but certainly the worst ones have all been dealt with. So the long-term plan for over the back of the layout just here is to continue the retaining wall. You can see we've got it just over there. That will continue around. That'll be just to sort of try and frame things in a little bit better, and it'll peter out and sort of merge into an embankment and these sort of bushes and shrubs and things over on this side by the housing estate. In the space behind it, I would like to put something resembling some form of a retail park, or at least some sort of big store in there. There's quite a lot of space, and I think a large low relief building could work quite well. So the plan is to put a Texas Home Care in there. For those of you that don't know, Texas Home Care was a very popular DIY store back in the 1980s and the 1990s. Long gone now, way before my time. I don't remember it. I don't think I ever set foot in one. So I think one of those would really help date this layout. It would sort of bring back some memories for people, and a lot of what I like to do is try and make the layout recognisable to people, even if they don't like trains. So in a lot of cases, you have to tell the era of somebody's layout by identifying the rolling stock and the liveries that the rolling stock is painted in. What I like to do is put pieces of pop culture and references to things in real life around the layout to help people understand when the layout is set, because not all of us are a train enthusiast. In fact, most of us are not a train enthusiast. So putting things like a Ghostbusters poster up on a wall, a car advert, a bit of advertising for cigarettes and stuff like that, or a store like Blockbuster or something, it's going to help people go, oh, that layout must be set in the 80s. So moving on from that corner, we start to work our way into the edge of the town, and as you can see, things are looking a little bit more urban now. So we've got an industrial estate sort of down here, very much still a work in progress. Mostly it's sort of automotive related. I have a background in classic car restoration, so for me it's nice to sort of do a little bit of car sort of stuff down there. So we've got a scrapyard, we've got a commercial specialist mostly doing vans, and then we've got some sort of second-hand car dealership here. This unit, I'm not sure exactly what this will be yet, maybe a timber merchant or scaffolding place, or I'm not really sure, but we'll sort something out for that in due course. Over the back there you can see we've got a large tower block. This is quite a sort of focal point for the layout, one of my favourite buildings that I've built so far. So there you can see the tower block a little bit better, and as I say, this is scratch build. There are a couple of videos on its construction if you are interested. It took me a very long time. I think if I remember correctly, I booked a week off work, and that was the only way I was able to get it done. But you can see it's got curtains, it's got all sorts of details, bits of weathering and all kinds of stuff all over it. It is also fully lit. Various rooms are lit with LEDs, and each one is a slightly different colour temperature, and it really gives you that sort of urban sort of feeling when the layout is in its night mode, if you like. In front of that, we've got a retaining wall that just continues its way along the back of the layout just there, and in front of that we've got various bits of detail, trees, bushes, shrubs, things like that, cable troughing, relay boxes, and of course there's a large signal gantry here. The signals are not currently wired up. That's a project for the future. The layout's quite simple in its track plan, so as such the signalling is relatively bare bones, relatively simple. There are places where signalling is needed, and I've not yet added it. Once again, a job for the future. The signal gantry is a brass kit. I think it's made by Traintronics, but I couldn't tell you. Brass kit, as I say, it's all soldered together, painted the appropriate colours. Really like it, and that just helps sort of set the scene as well, with it being a 4-track main line. Further up we've got a signal box. The signal box on the Great Western Main Line by this point would have been very much living on borrowed time, coming to the end of its life before everything got handed over to a signalling centre. But let's just, for argument's sake, say that this signal box is currently just about still in use, managing the transition between the Great Western Main Line and the branch. You can see once again I've worked hard in this area to put all of the necessary detail with regards to speed restrictions, point motors, safety railings, relay cabinets, equipment platforms, undergrowth, weathering, bushes, shrubs, various buildings, and all of the track weathering and static grass as well. So the track on the 4 tracks running around the main portion of the layout, this is what they call flat bottom rail. This is the sort of modern style of railway track that you commonly see even today. This is the concrete sleeper style, albeit very heavily weathered. So we've got Peco Code 75 flat bottom rail, and I was mad enough to cut the webbing on all the sleepers and space the sleepers out a little bit further than how they come from the box from Peco. So personally, to my eyes, I think the track work looks a lot more convincing and more realistic done like that. It is a mad job to do, and it takes absolutely ages. I wouldn't recommend doing it, but if you've got a smaller layout and you want things to look a little bit more realistic without going for something like EM or P4 gauge, I think it's a fair compromise. The track on the branch line is Peco bullhead rail. You can see this has a different appearance, and it certainly looks a lot older. It's also supported on wooden sleepers, or at least in real life. These ones are obviously plastic. The track is cut into 60-foot lengths, scale 60-foot lengths, and then joined at the various places along its length, and that just gives you a little bit more of a realistic appearance, as that's typically how this stuff was laid back in the sort of 40s and 50s. And yeah, gives you a nice noise when the train's running down the track, and just looks that little bit more convincing. All of the point work on the scenic side of the layout is the Peco bullhead points. So something that often confuses people is they'll see track with concrete sleepers, and then they'll see the points with wooden sleepers, and they think, well, that's wrong, that doesn't look right. Well, actually it was the norm for many, many years, right up into the 2000s, and you can still find it today if you know where to look. So having these bullhead points with the wooden sleepers connected to flat bottom rail with the concrete sleepers is actually very realistic for this time period, and I think a really nice touch. Another reason for using them is the bullhead points from Peco are just much more realistic looking than their equivalent flat bottom point work. This comes down to the sleeper spacing, and is another reason why I respaced all of the concrete sleepers on the layout. So I'm really happy with how all that turned out, but it really was a massive job to do, and I would certainly think twice about doing it again. So looking at the front of the layout, you can see the second-hand car dealership just there. This would be the workshop for it. At some point I will add the appropriate signage and an interior, as well as lighting. Here we've got the commercial place. This is based on a real building, relatively local to me, and you can see it's just full of various vans, trucks and things like that. And that then transitions into the scrapyard, the subject of a recent video and various videos before it. If you're interested in the scrapyard, there are numerous videos on the entire construction of this thing. It's gone through a few changes and improvements over that time, and again, a little bit of a focal point for the layout, somewhere that draws your eye in. I'm really pleased with it, but of course as well, I've got an automotive background, and obviously doing something car related is always going to appeal to me. Moving along from the scrapyard, we transition into the canal scene, and this is where the layout probably changes the most versus the previous layout tour. Certainly from a track work perspective, everything from this point onwards has been ripped out and completely relaid. It took absolutely ages. I did the majority of it over the course of last year, and I'm really pleased with how it's turned out. It looks more realistic. I've managed to get things done to a better standard. Obviously, as you work your way through a layout, you tend to learn a lot of stuff and you want to improve things. So this was a great opportunity to come back and make some changes and some improvements. I'll talk through the main reasons for doing all of that as we work our way around the corner. So from this point onwards, all the track work is relayed, and as a result of doing all that work, the scrapyard did suffer a bit of damage, which was another reason why I decided to redevelop that in a more recent video. Panning further over to the left, you can see we've got a sort of office building here, as well as another sort of smaller office building with a shop on the base of it, and we're now sort of transitioning now into the main sort of town area on the layout. The canal was a lot of fun to build. It's basically a sheet of plywood with some plywood sides. I've then made up my own canal piling. The canal piling is made using card and a lot of matchsticks. Quite a tedious job, but in doing that you can make the canal go around a curve, and I think it looks quite cool with the canal on a curve rather than being dead straight. Once again, this is a redevelopment. There was a previous canal in this section, but in the learning I took from that, was able to come back, revisit it, and do something a little bit more realistic, and I think at least to a higher standard. The canal is made from basically epoxy resin, using the Woodland Scenics deep pour water system. I went for the murky water, and in the base of the canal there is a lot of junk, traffic cones, tyres, bin bags, bikes and things like that. If you get the light right, you can see through the epoxy resin and you can see into the base of the canal. You can see all that junk that's lying around in there. Certainly back in the 80s, before the Canal and River Trust and stuff like that existed, canals in Britain were in a bad way, and I've sort of tried to portray that a little bit in this section. Obviously it's still possible to navigate the canal, but it's certainly showing signs of neglect and wear and tear. Just another little nod to the era that this layout is set in. On the far side of the canal, we've got this nasty corrugated iron fence to sort of wall off the edge of the scrapyard, and you can see that a slightly careless forklift truck driver has accidentally dropped a washing machine from the scrapyard into the canal. This fence is a kit from Goodwood Scenics, and while it's not cheap, it is quite effective, and it's made from real pieces of corrugated aluminium. Moving to the left, we transition into the rest of the town. You can see we've got the first building just here. I left the building here open as it sort of gets cut off by the edge of the baseboard. I'm still in two minds as to whether or not to board it up, but it does afford some interesting views out of the windows. So moving deeper into the town, the first building that appeared in this section was another one of my scratch builds, and that's this office block here. This is loosely based on a building in St Albans Road in Watford. I used to live in Watford, not far from St Albans Road, and I remember seeing this building when I was a small child in the 1990s. The first and second floor are occupied by the fictitious insurance company of Farce Insurance, and then we've got a small market shop on the left hand side, your sort of typical sort of groceries and fresh produce, things like that. On the ground floor on the right hand side we've got Rumblow's, which was I believe an electronics store back in the 80s, early 90s. Not exactly sure when they went bust, but they're certainly not around anymore, and I certainly never remember seeing one. It just is another thing, yet again, to help date the layout. Adjoining that building we've got this. This is a relatively new structure I built not too long ago. As you can see, it's an older style of building, and you can see it's considerably more filthy. Across the street we've got this thing. This will eventually become a restaurant, quite a sizable restaurant, and I haven't quite decided if it's going to be a popular chain or an independent, but it's got some nice big windows on it. It's loosely based on a real building in London, and the big windows just allow you to get some interesting camera angles, see through it and stuff like that. I'm sure it'll look quite effective when it's all lit. Along the street we've got some terraced houses. These are based on real buildings in Brixton, albeit loosely based. Just took a little bit of inspiration from those. Once again, just trying to make things look as realistic as I can. We've got the road going off around the corner. It goes underneath the layout and just comes back on itself. The road does work. It uses the Magna Rail car system, which I made a video about quite a few years ago now. It is a very effective system. It's a good way to get cars moving on your layout. It won't do things like trucks, buses and vans, but it'll get the cars moving. A lot of the other stuff, like Fowler, with regards to making cars work, is mostly confined to trucks, buses and vans, and the system is rather expensive per vehicle. It can be a bit of a challenge to install it correctly. It is very susceptible to various environmental effects and a lack of precision. You know, if you've got a bit of a gap between the chain and the road surface, your car will lose its magnetism to the chain. There's lots of things to be wary of. This is my second go at installing it, and so far it's worked very well. Quite happy with how it's been performing. This has been in place now for I think about 2 years, and currently it's still working as intended. As I mentioned previously, all of the track work above it has been completely relayed on new baseboards, so it was quite a challenge to do all that whilst preserving the functionality of the Magna Rail system and not causing any damage. But so far at least I seem to have got away with it, and everything seems to be working fine. Moving further down the street, we've got various things like litter bins, litter itself, bits of moss growing between the paving slabs, obviously all of the buildings, parking for cars. Obviously we've got the working road system as well. All of the paving slabs are individually laid, and yes, that's doing that is about as interesting as it sounds. As I've mentioned in a previous video, these houses are still a work in progress. I'm beginning to wonder if they will ever be finished. They just sink so many hours, but I am pleased with how they've come out. Still a lot to do, but they certainly look presentable, at least on the front anyway. The back of the houses is another story. Quite a lot left to do there, but as it's pretty much impossible to see, it's not a high priority right now. We've also got a couple of units there, so these retaining walls run all the way behind these houses at the bottom of the gardens. Again, typical for the sort of London sort of area, London sort of vibe in Brixton. And these are mostly either privately rented or very small businesses for mostly domestic stuff. So you can see I've got a plumber situated in that one just there. You might see the odd garage, the odd minicab place, and the rest of them usually are just no name and just rented out as private storage, that type of thing. So that's the idea with those. Once again, just a nod to the region and the era that the layout is set in. Looking further up, you can see we've got this small sort of storage area for a few locomotives and DMUs behind the lines just there, and then we've got all 5 of the lines coming around here. So we've got the branch closest to the camera, and then we've got the 2 main lines, and then the 2 relief lines in the background. So looking down, as I mentioned previously, that section there is where this layout is completely different versus the last layout tour. The main reason for ripping all of that up and starting again was this curve. I was never happy with the radius of the curve that I originally built. It was a little bit poorly laid in a few places, and it really needed sorting out. And as you can see, we've got a beautifully smooth, gentle curve on all 5 of those lines running around into the station side of the layout. And I'm really pleased with how that's turned out. It was a lot of work to do. It took a very long time, most of it being done towards the beginning of last year. As you can see, all of the track had its sleepers respaced. I think it looks a lot better, and you can see how it matches the sleeper spacing on the Pico bullhead track. So for those of you that don't know, the bullhead track here comes like that. That's how it looks out of the box. The tracks behind it come with the sleepers much closer together, and when you have the 2 tracks side by side, it does look a bit strange. So for that reason, I went ahead and respaced every single individual sleeper, and it was a huge amount of work. Obviously, if you wanted to take things further, you could regauge and go to something like EM or P4, but that's a whole separate argument, discussion, and a hobby in itself. And then you can see that transitions into 3 basic sidings just to store a few items of rolling stock and stuff like that. And this is I suppose a nod, if you like, to some of the carriage sidings that you might find along the Great Western Main Line during the era the layout is set. Obviously this is a very tiny compromised version of that, but I've only got so much space to work with. So working our way around, we arrive at this dead-end street. This is loosely based or inspired by an area not far from Stuarts Lane Depot in London. I've taken some liberties with it as I'm limited on space, but basically we've got a series of railway arch shops and sort of service providers, things like that. This is one of the areas I constructed more recently, with the bulk of it being done towards the early part of this year, and I'm really happy with how this area turned out. I really like the sort of urban feeling that it's got, and it's nice to have the station situated up above with the trains running through. Some of the shops are entirely fictitious and other ones are real. This one, for example, Top Gift, that is actually in Brixton in London, and I've done my best to sort of copy how that sort of set of shops looks, at least in this style of retaining wall. We've got various cars parked along the street, done a lot of weathering to the road and just generally made things look a little bit used and abused. A little bit of graffiti here and there, and you can see there's various figures dotted around the place. On this side of the layout I've got quite a few more figures installed. They will make an appearance in other places as well as time progresses. These are all 3D printed figures from Fine Scale Figures. They take quite a while to paint, but they're very effective looking. Quite a few of the figures are just painted up randomly, but a number of them are also based on friends and family, and you'll see those dotted around the layout. So for example, there's me looking at buying a new washing machine, although I'm not convinced I'd really want either of those two. And we've got various other figures as well, and You'll know who you are, but there are various people I have portrayed in miniature on this layout. Moving towards the end of the street, you can see we've got basically a dead end, and it just sort of turns into waste ground. Once again, very limited for space, so I can only do so much in this section. We're really pleased with how that's turned out, especially with things like trains coming into the station up above. I'll be adding some bollards and some other bits and pieces to give a bit more of a permanent end to the end of the street, and maybe make a couple of changes here and there to the pavement, but for the most part I'm just leaving it as is and enjoying it. It took a long time to build. Behind this section there isn't much to see yet. Obviously we've got the station platforms. Took quite a while to build those. And in the background there will be retaining wall detail and additional low relief buildings if I can squeeze them in. And that's a job hopefully for towards the end of the year or even next year. But yeah, quite a lot to do in this area, in a similar vein to the corner on the other side of the layout where it progresses into the countryside section. I'd like to make a bit more progress over on this bit. We're very happy with where it's sort of got to at this point, but there's always something to do. It's never finished. Over on this section here, we've got a continuation of the previous canal. If you recall, over on the other side of the layout by the scrapyard, the canal was taking a turn, and basically that turn is heading in this direction. So it was logical to continue the canal underneath the station just here, and that's what I've done. We've got a pedestrian footbridge installed up here. That's just scratch built. The idea is that you could walk down the street, go over here, down here, up the stairs to gain access to the station, or if you wanted to, you could walk underneath. You could get out the other side, and you could head into the main station building, if you like, over on the far side of the platform. Once again, there are various figures dotted around the place, and they are based on friends and family, people I've worked with. In this case, this is a chap I used to work with. You will have noticed along the various sections that the roads have all got streetlights fitted, and of course they do indeed work, and they've got that nice orange glow that was typical for the time period back when the street lighting left something to be desired. When the layout's working at night time with everything switched off and the layout lighting switched on, certainly makes for a very moody sort of looking scene. It can be very difficult to film, but trust me, to the naked eye, I'm really pleased with how I've managed to get a lot of the lighting on this layout. Passing the canal, we've got an embankment here which works its way up to the station car park, where we've just got a simple brick wall, and then the car park itself begins. Now, of course, the car park is relatively small, but as you can see, I've deliberately placed it right on the edge of the baseboard just there. So of course the idea is that the car park is much, much larger than this and would just continue off scene. But once again, it's a model railway. Your biggest enemy is always available space. I really enjoyed building this section. All of the walling and paving and everything is scratch built, with the exception of a few 3D printed accessories and some curbstones from scale model scenery. All of the vehicles are from Oxford Diecast, and as you can see, I've sort of painted and modified each one to make them look a little bit more convincing. We've got various different models of car in there, and they've all been painted in such a way to give them a bit of age and make them look a bit more appropriate for the era. You can see over towards the back here, we've got some disabled access, albeit relatively limited and not that good, but that was what you got back in the 1980s and 1990s. To be honest, to be lucky if you got it at all. You'll see there's no disabled parking, again typical for a station like this. They didn't really care, not back then anyway. Now we live in a much more considerate world that thinks about all this sort of stuff, but over 30 years ago you'd be really lucky as a disabled person if you actually found anywhere that would look after you. We've also got a flight of stairs, and you can see the sort of entrance there to the sort of rudimentary waiting room sort of building just there. Nothing too fancy and very typical for what might have been put up during the 1960s when this area was remodelled. The main station building itself is over on the far side just there, and the majority of this is a large office building with the ground and first floor being dedicated to the station. This took a very long time to build. It was a lot of fun putting together, and hopefully if you're familiar with the area of Swindon, you might recognise this building. It is somewhat loosely based on the building over Swindon Station, known as Signal Point. Certainly today looking a little bit sorry for itself with lots of plywood and boarded up windows, but back in the 70s and 80s it was looking a little bit more respectable, and that's how I've modelled it here. To gain access to this building from the far side, obviously you need a footbridge, so we have a footbridge here. This is still early days for this thing, it's a work in progress. It's loosely based on the footbridge at Oxford, with the sort of tinted glass, reinforced concrete prefab sort of thing. The real footbridge at Oxford was built in around 1989, I think, so I've deliberately made this thing look relatively clean, and yeah, so that's how you get across the various station platforms. Obviously the platforms themselves are in dire need of considerably more detail. That's a job for the future. Overlooking the station, we've got this set of flats, the ground floor being shops, on the other side at least, and the first and second floor being mostly flats. You can see there's a communal walkway that runs along the back, and once again this building is all lit, and it certainly looks like a rather unpleasant place to visit when it's all lit up during the night. It certainly wouldn't catch me walking down that alleyway. This is only a small area, but it's surprising what you can do if you cram lots of details and accessories and bits and pieces in. The figures really help as well, having pedestrians dotted around the place. You can see a few of them dotted around there. There's another chap I used to work with leaning up against the wall just there, and got some bikes and stuff in the sort of bike rack just there. Got a post box, telephone booth, appropriate signage. Got some graffiti over the back. There's a parking ticket machine down there, all of the various bollards. We've got the street lights painted in the Network South East red. Very pleased with those. Bit of period correct advertising. If you're a train enthusiast, that would help you date the layout. If you're a smoking enthusiast, that would also help you date the layout. The fence on top is a brass kit, that's from PH Designs, and there's a few other random bits and bobs dotted around before you go down the stairs. But yeah, quite pleased with this area. It was a lot of fun to build. Obviously it's only a small section and there's a lot to do over on the station itself. If you're curious about this station building, I did make an entire video dedicated to the construction of that thing, and that'll give you a better idea for what's involved with regards to scratch building. And that pretty much takes us to the final section of the layout. And here we are. So on the far side of the flats, here's the very end of the layout. As you can see, I've made a huge amount of progress in this section. I've got absolutely nothing done. But the intention is at some point this will be becoming some sort of a high street, and there'll be some buildings on the left hand side to complement these ones. As is typical with a lot of the buildings on the layout, this one is once again based on a real building, albeit loosely. There's a set of buildings at Ealing Broadway that look very similar to this, and I've used that as inspiration. And you can also see we've got various shops on the ground floor just there, and all of those hark back to a different time, again allowing for easy recognition of the time period. So moving from this section over to the unfinished street section, we find ourselves back at the beginning where we started this video, at the entrance to the Fiddle Yard. So hopefully that gives you a good indication of how this layout is constructed, where it goes and what it does. It is basically a large rectangle with a branch line that goes off to the side slightly and then comes back once it's turned around. But the majority of the layout is just a big rectangle with a large 4-metre storage area on one side and a trio of scenic sections around the other 3 sides. So that concludes the layout tour. Quite a few people have been requesting that over the past few months, and I appreciate a lot has actually changed since I originally filmed the first layout tour back in 2021. Surprising, until you actually get down and walk around the room and talk through everything in detail, it can be hard to appreciate what's changed in that time. But
I'm really pleased with the progress I've managed to make. Obviously, I am just one guy working in my spare time. Whilst these videos may give the impression that I'm some sort of hermit that lives in the loft and just builds a model railway, I can assure you that couldn't be further from the truth, and that's one of the reasons why the videos are relatively infrequent. I have a life outside of this attic, as hard as that may be to believe, and this is something I just do to unwind in my spare time. So it takes a long time to build, and I don't rush or push myself or force myself to do it. If you do that, you'll run out of interest and you'll run out of enthusiasm. So if I can give you any advice with a model railway, it would be take it at your own pace and don't feel pressured to make progress. If you don't feel like working on it, don't work on it. The more you force yourself to work on it, the more you'll get fed up with it, and you'll find yourself a year later tearing the whole thing down and never coming back to the hobby again. It's a hobby that takes an extraordinary amount of time and patience and energy, but the worst thing you can do is force yourself to do it. So I hope you enjoyed that little tour of the layout. I'll be back as soon as I can with the next video when I've made enough progress to get something filmed. As I say, it's something I do in the free time. It's really nice to come up here and unwind and build stuff and just chill out, but I don't push myself to do it. I don't do it all the time, and as a result of that, it takes a while for the videos to come through. So I appreciate your patience. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again on the next one.